Hi everyone, it's Miss Haig here. I hope you're staying safe and well. Today we're going to be looking at prejudice in chapter 4 of Mice and Men. I'm going to be setting you some mini tasks to do within the video, and we're going to be focusing primarily on the first two paragraphs of chapter 4 before having a look at short chunks throughout the rest of the chapter. We'll also be reviewing contextual work you did looking at racism in 1930s America. But before we get into all of that, let's just clarify the plot of chapter 4. So all the men have gone into town because it's Saturday night, except for Lenny, Andy and Crooks. Crooks reluctantly allows Lenny into his room where they talk, and Crooks taunts Lenny that George might not return, which would leave Lenny completely on his own. Lenny begins to panic about that, and Crooks is forced to apologise in an attempt to calm Lenny down. Andy joins them, and he and Lenny let slip to Crooks their intention to buy a farm, that American dream, that thread that runs throughout the text. They're interrupted by Curly's wife, who's looking for company. Candy and Crooks resent her being present. They are really quite suspicious of her. And when Crooks orders her out of his room, she attacks him verbally, using her superior social status as a white woman to do that. So now we've recapped what happens in chapter 4. Let's recap and review the context work that I set you in a previous lesson. So when you were looking at context, the first thing that you looked at was the difference between prejudice and discrimination. And you learned that prejudice are the ideas that affect our view of certain groups of people or certain individuals. And then discrimination is when those thoughts influence action. And discrimination can be positive or negative. Now, in terms of race in America in the 1930s, it was entirely negative discrimination against Black Americans. So it's important to remember that we're not that far after the abolition of slavery in America at this time. Slavery was abolished in 1865. So not only are there people at the time who would have remembered or would have even been slave owners and slaves themselves, but those ideas, those prejudices that enabled the perpetuation of slavery, the continuance of slavery, are still very much part of American culture. The idea of white supremacy, the idea of Black Americans as second-class citizens or even no better than animals, those views were still very much a part of the fabric of society. And it went even further. With regard to discrimination, one of the most disturbing things to our mind nowadays is that in America, discrimination was enshrined into law through the use of the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws popped up between 1865 and the 1960s, and they were at state level, so each state in America set their own laws. And these Jim Crow laws legalized segregation and discrimination. So these laws deliberately limited the opportunities open to Black Americans, and also limited the protections that law could give them. They were all based around the idea of separate, equal. So facilities needed to be equal in the sense that you needed to provide healthcare for both white and Black Americans. You needed to provide education for both white and Black Americans. Other services needed to be provided for white and Black Americans as well, such as transport, for example, parks. But segregation could be enforced. And with that segregation, what often was found is that the facilities provided for Black Americans were very substandard, which immediately limited what Black Americans could achieve, help they could get, and kind of kept them, for use of a better phrase, and I'm putting this in inverted commas, ladies and gents, in their place. So essentially, Black Americans couldn't challenge the perceived supremacy of white Americans. You've also got discrimination from white supremacist groups such as the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. These groups were racially violent, often participating in lynchings, so hangings, for very, very minor things. So a few years after this, or in the 1950s, a boy who was about 14 called Emmett Till was murdered by white supremacists because he'd wolf whistled at a white woman. They took that as an insult, so that very, very, very minor action they took as an insult that warranted in their minds the murder of that boy. And you also saw that throughout the 1930s, that minor actions, or sometimes even no actions at all, warranted in these groups' minds the murder of Black Americans. Something more specific to the Depression also occurred. Remember, the 1930s were at the Great Depression. There's a lot of pressure on jobs because there was a scarce number of jobs. That put a lot of pressure on incomes and the economy as well, and being able to provide for your families. And what you started to see in the Great Depression is discrimination in the form of protests in northern cities such as Chicago, for example. So in these protests, white Americans would protest to fire Black Americans so that there were more jobs for white people at the time, and therefore more money. So they were subjected to discrimination, both enshrined within law in terms of protests attacking the ability of Black Americans to provide for their families and themselves, and were discriminated against in terms of racial violence, really nasty violence that often went unpunished. And don't forget, we are still 20 to 30 years before the civil rights movement that really gained traction in the 50s and the 60s. And we're 20 to 30 years before figures such as Dr. Martin Luther King, who made great strides towards racial equality in the United States. So let's start having a look at chapter 4 then. We're going to focus on these two paragraphs first of all. These are the very first paragraphs of chapter 4. We're going to read them through. I'm going to clarify some context that's pretty specific in here, and then I'm going to give you some tasks to do. So chapter 4 begins. Crooks, the Negro stable book, had his bunk in the harness room, a little shed that leaned off the wall of the barn. On one side of the little room there was a square 4-paned window, and on the other a narrow plank door leading into the barn. Crooks's bunk was a long box filled with straw, on which his blankets were flung. On the wall by the window there were pegs on which hung broken harness in the process of being mended, strips of new leather, and under the window itself a little bench for leather working tools, curved knives, and needles and balls of linen thread, and a small hand riveter. On pegs were also pieces of harness, a split collar with horsehair stuffing sticking out, a broken hame, and a trace chain with its leather covering split. Crooks had his apple box over his bunk, and in it a range of medicine bottles both for himself and the horses. There were cans of saddle soap and a drippy can of tar with its paintbrush sticking over the edge. And scattered about the floor were a number of personal possessions. For being alone, Crooks could leave his things about, and being a stable book and a cripple, he was more permanent than the other men, and he had accumulated more possessions than he could carry on his back. Crooks possessed several pairs of shoes, a pair of rubber boots, a big alarm clock, and a single-barreled shotgun. And he had books too, a tattered dictionary, and a mauled copy of the California Civil Code for 1905. There were battered magazines, and a few dirty books on a special shelf over his bunk. A pair of large gold-rimmed spectacles hung from a nail on the wall above his bed. So, a couple of things we need to be aware of then. It talks a lot about saddles and harnesses, hames and trace chains, and that's all linked to this picture right here of the horses. These are draft horses, so very large horses whose primary job, the job that they're bred for, is to move heavy machinery. Over here, we tend to use them, or we used to use them for ploughing, or you might see them being used at brewers for moving carts and things like that. So as you can see in this picture, horses have got a lot of harnesses on that are connecting, in this case, off shot to a plough. So you can see all the metalwork and the leather work. They've got the harness around the neck, which would have been filled with horsehair. This is the hane down here, which would lead to the trace chain, and that trace chain would link to the plough or the dray, the cart, whatever it was. So when it's referring to leatherworking and to any of those references to collars or hanes, it's referring to harness work for horses such as this. The other thing that you won't be too familiar with is the California Civil Code for 1905. This is referring to the law for California in 1905. This book was used by lawyers. It outlined every law that was within the state of California, enacted within the state of California. It was an up-to-date volume that lawyers could use to check the law and they were pursuing legal cases. So let's have a little look at the tasks that I want you to do. So I want you to reread that description of Crooks's room. I want you to consider what your first impressions of the room are and annotate the source with your ideas. Remember, we're not writing lots of paragraphs here, we're annotating, so this is note taking. You underline or highlight your quote, you jot your ideas around it. Think about any aspects of the room which might be a surprise to the reader when considering the context that we've just talked about. And think about why these elements might be surprising. What do you think that suggests about Crooks's character? And finally, why might Steinbeck take advantage of that view? We're going to pause the video now, so press pause, have a little look at that, and when you come back, we'll go through some of your ideas. Okay, welcome back everyone. So, you've had a little look at this particular section, and what I've tried to do here is pull out some key moments from this text that I think are worthy of looking at. You might have something different, and that's perfectly okay. You might have something the same. What I would like you to do as we go through this is take the opportunity to add to your notes. Unfortunately, I can't annotate it. I will be talking through the ideas as we go. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is this, that Crooks had his bunk in the harness room. And that really goes back to this idea of the Jim Crow laws, separate but equal. Crooks has been provided with a bunk, same as the other men, the white workers on the ranch, but he's segregated, so he's in the harness room, and his bunk is therefore in a very temporary room. It's not in a purpose-built bunk room. He's had to fit in around the working ranch. The harness room would be where they would keep all the harnesses for the horses. It tells us that this harness room is just a little shed leaned off the wall of the barn. So not only is he in a harness room, he's also in a barn. He's being very much treated as if he is a second-class citizen here. He's put wherever it's appropriate. And it's important to note that the idea of the barn centres around the idea of animals. Is Steinbeck saying that the boss of the ranch is treating Crooks no better than an animal? Possibly. He's certainly saying that he's treated as a second-class citizen here. That's reinforced when Steinbeck describes the bunk that Crooks actually has. It's a long box filled with straw, different to the bunk that the men have in the bunkhouse with mattresses. It sounds like something an animal would use. It links in with that idea of being near the barn, near the stables, very animalistic. So it's highlighting the degradation of Crooks as a human being. He is treated as less than. He is treated no better than an animal. That's also linked to this quote over here, the fact that Crooks was a stable book and a cripple. Now I've picked this out because it gives us a new spin on Crooks's name. Somebody's a cripple if they are physically disabled. It's a very crude way of describing somebody who's got a physical disability. We would say it's not politically correct now. It's not appropriate. It's very rude to use that language. If Crooks is physically disabled, that links into his name. Crooks has actually got a problem with his back. His back is crooked. So is Crooks his name, or is that simply a disrespectful nickname the ranch workers have given him to reflect his crooked back, his physical disability? When we look at it in that way and make comparisons to Candy, for example, who is given a name, Candy, it's certainly not disrespectful at all, we start to see that there is very much a double standard in the way that the ranch workers treat Crooks because he is black. He is disrespected and somewhat ridiculed because of his physical disability, compared to Candy, who is respected somewhat more. Now, the question that I asked you, or the task that I asked you to complete, required you to think about things that might be surprising in Crooks's room. And I've picked out a few things down here. And they all centre on the idea that Crooks is presented as actually a very intelligent man. A very intelligent man. Also, perhaps somebody who is very much wanting to protect himself as well. So we're told that he has books. The other men have magazines, as we saw in chapter 3. They have magazines that cowboys liked to read with letters and short stories, things like that. Crooks's books are much more academic, not there for simple entertainment. They are there for learning. And we're told that he has a tattered dictionary. We all know what a dictionary is. It's about learning what words mean, where words come from, so the etymology of words. It's very much centred on learning. And the dictionary's tattered, so it's been very well used, as has the mauled copy of the California Civil Code. Now, as we said when I was giving you an outline of this specific context, California Civil Code was a volume which contained the laws for California at the time, in this case 1905, and it would have been used by lawyers when they were pursuing various legal cases. Now, this copy has been mauled, so it's not just well used, it's been really well used. It's mauled, it's perhaps barely hanging together anymore. And that clearly shows a high level of intelligence on Crooks's part, because don't forget, lawyers have their very own legal language. There will be technical language within that civil code that the likes of you and me will not understand because we are not trained in that language. It also perhaps suggests that Crooks has been very careful to look at where he stands within the law, which links to this idea of him wanting to protect himself. He is at a disadvantage in this world, don't forget, because of the likes of the Jim Crow laws, because of that embedded, institutionalized racism that happens and that occurs at the time. So there's clearly a sense that not only is he very intelligent, but he's also wanting to use that intelligence to make sure that he is safe. And that intelligence continues with this image, this final image, a pair of large gold-rimmed spectacles. So the fact that his glasses are gold-rimmed, he spent quite a bit of money on these. This wouldn't be cheap, so he clearly values this piece of equipment, this equipment that enables him to see properly. But don't forget, we often also associate spectacles, glasses, with that sense of intelligence as well. So Steinbeck is really indicating to us here that Crooks is a very learned man. He's using that intelligence, that learning, to protect himself as well. So let's have a little look at some power shifts. For this, I want you to focus on the rest of chapter 4. So I've got a glossary for you. This is from shortly after the first 2 paragraphs when Crooks and Lenny are speaking. So you've got the word aloof, which means not friendly or forthcoming, being cool and distant. And then you've got the word fawning, which means displaying exaggerated flattery or affection. You will come across those words in the rest of chapter 4. And what I would like you to do is consider 3 tasks. First of all, why do you think Crooks gets so much satisfaction out of torturing Lenny? By making Lenny think or considering that George might not return and then Lenny would be completely alone. Why does he get so much satisfaction out of doing that when he knows that it will upset Lenny? For the second task, I want you to consider the quotation, "Suddenly Lenny's eyes centred and grew quiet and mad. He stood up and walked dangerously towards Crooks." And I want you to consider how that angry reaction is different to what we've seen from Lenny's violence before. And just as a reminder, I've picked out 2 quotations from across the text. So the first quotation I've picked out is from chapter 1, when Lenny is talking about the mice. And he says, "I'd pet 'em, and pretty soon they bit my fingers, and I pinched their heads a little, and then they was dead, because they were so little." So how is that violence different to this angry reaction and this violence here? And the second quote I've picked out is from chapter 3. As we already know, Lenny is getting attacked by Curly. Curly has used Lenny's smirk as an excuse to attack him, prove his worth, because we know that Curly's got a serious case of short man syndrome. And so Lenny's getting attacked. He's not really standing up for himself at all. In fact, he's curling into a bit of a ball while he's getting punched. And George says, "I said get him." On those words, Lenny crushes Curly's hand. So those two examples I've given you, how do they differ compared to the quote that you've got on screen, a quote from chapter 4? And then finally, you've got the quotation, "It was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger." So what is Crooks pleased about and why? So pause the video and take a moment to consider those questions, please. You will need to have a look at the text. You've got a copy of that, and you will need to think about your answers in as much detail as possible. Okay, welcome back. So now we're going to have a look at the quotation that you've got at the top of your screen. It says, "An N and a dum-dum and a lousy old sheep, and liking it because they ain't nobody else." This is a quote from Curly's wife. So Curly's wife has come into the barn, seen Candy, Crooks and Lenny in Crooks's room, and she wants company. Now they have rejected her, not really speaking to her at this point. They're trying to ignore her, so she goes away. And in a bit of a rant, this quote is something that Curly's wife says. Now what I would like you to do first of all is consider what those four characters have in common: Crooks, Lenny, Candy and Curly's wife. So they are very different characters on the surface of it, but what is the one thing they all have in common? Then I want you to think about the quotation itself. What does that tell you about society and society's views on certain things? You've got to think about the language that's used there. We've got the N-word being used, which we know is an absolutely horrendous racial slur. You've got a reference to Lenny as a dum-dum. We know that Lenny's got mental health issues and is mentally disabled in some respects. And then the reference to Candy, a lousy old sheep. Old, don't forget, means old. So what does that line tell you about society and society's views? But finally, I want you to think a bit more widely about Curly's wife. It's clearly a very, very nasty comment, and she comes across as a very nasty character in this particular chapter, as we will see shortly. But what other emotions or feelings or behaviours accompany that nastiness? Why is she so nasty? And why do we think those emotions are there? So pause the video again. Consider that quotation. You might want to write it in your exercise book and jot your ideas around it. And come back when you're ready to continue. Okay, we're back and we're on to our last little bit. Now this is towards the end of chapter 4. And Brooks has ordered Curly's wife to leave his room. He says that she's not welcome there, that he doesn't want her there, and she really works on using her her position as a white woman, so her white supremacy, her white privilege, to exert power over her, over him even. So let's read it through. Think about the question at the bottom of this particular slide. How does Steinbeck present race and power dynamics here? Remember, Crooks is a black man, Curly's wife is a white woman. She closed on him. You know what I could do? Crook seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. Yes, ma'am. Will you keep your place then, N? I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny. Crooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, yes, ma'am, and his voice was toneless. For a moment she stood over him, as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again. Crooks sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything that might hurt drawn in. So, I want you to think about race and power dynamics here. How does Curly's wife exert her power? How does she use race to exert that power and to gain some power over Crooks? And what do you make of Crooks's reaction? Why does he reduce himself to nothing? Why does he grow smaller and press himself against the wall? Why does he draw everything that might hurt in? So think about those questions, ladies and gents. That's your final task for this video. And thank you very much for listening. I hope you get on with work well, and I'm sure I will see you back on YouTube again for another video shortly.